Microsoft 365 Virtual Marathon. Welcome. It's really nice to have you. This is a sort of a first time for this type of event, officially supported and sponsored by the formerly known as SharePoint Conference, which was actually supposed to be happening just a couple days ago, but has been delayed until next March, but also has been renamed to the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference, which is you're able to come and join us next March in Las Vegas, where we're going to be talking about Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, Power Platform, and that's not it. It's all of the entire gamut that is the Office 365 system. With that, I do have to say a special thanks to our sponsors, especially AvePoint for this session. They decided to sponsor this session and support me. We've worked together a bunch of times on Office 365, Teams, and other related help sort of resources out there. So many thanks to AvePoint and the other generous sponsors for this, because it would not happen without them. But jumping right into the topic tonight, my name is Matt Wade. I am the VP of Client Engagement for the no-code chatbot solution for the Microsoft Cloud called atbot. But I'm also an Office 365 MVP, so I spend a lot of time in Microsoft Teams and Azure as well. But generally, my work and my portfolio is filled very much with a lot of the stuff from the Office 365 space. So today we're going to be talking about Microsoft 365 Groups, formerly known as Office 365 Groups. They have been renamed as a part of branding change that came about at the end of March, early April. And we're going to talk about some of the structural aspects behind the scenes of how groups work and also how you can put them to use, especially juggling a few of the different kinds that there are. The session is going to be about 45 minutes long, and you can feel free to ask questions in the Q&A area. We have a producer on site on the meeting here who will pass along questions if I can answer them along the way, and I can spend some time a couple minutes afterwards answering questions. That being said, I'm very findable on social media, so you can follow me on Twitter and connect with me on LinkedIn. I will accept any invitations on LinkedIn, and also feel free to reach out to me via those methods if you want some clarification or want some of the source files, anything like that. So we're going to dive right in here. From a technical standpoint, Microsoft 365 groups require a few things that you want to be aware of. For the most part, people that come to sessions like this are generally from the IT side of things. Not necessarily the case for everybody, of course, but I do want to cover a couple things here. So if this is a little bit above your head, the rest of it will not be, I swear. That's not going to be too technical or too complex. Well, it might be complex, but that's not from a technical standpoint, more from a way things are just built sort of standpoint. But first off, if you are going to use Microsoft 365 groups, which it's still hard to get myself to say that because they've always been Office 365 groups, the first thing you need to have is licenses to SharePoint Online for all of the people that are going to be members of these groups. You also need at least an Exchange Online account for at least the group itself, because each group does get an Exchange mailbox and an Exchange calendar. It's best practice, I'll say, to make sure that all of the members of the group also have Exchange Online, just to make things easier. Hybrid situations, can work, but I still think the cloud-only perspective, especially if you're going to make the most use of groups and cloud-heavy tools like Microsoft Teams, you should definitely try to stick to having Exchange Online for everybody. Another big thing is U.S. government tenants, so the GCC, Government Community Cloud, GCC High, GCC DoD. A lot of these features come late, so I might be discussing some tools or options that are available currently within the commercial or education clouds that will not be available in GCC and may not be for 6 to 12 months. Also, Yammer, which is one of the big topics we'll be talking about tonight, completely not available at all on GCC. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you're coming from the government space, I hear you. I'm so sorry. Sometimes you just have to wait, and this is one of those situations where a lot of the waiting will happen for full features. And then the last thing is, especially from the IT side of things, but for anybody on the call who is just an everyday user, be knowledgeable, keep up to date. You are on a cloud platform now, and things change. They change reasonably rapidly, sometimes without really any fanfare or any heads up that things are going to be happening. So I just want to kind of put that out there and make sure that people know that they really should be looking and making an effort to go follow resources, the Microsoft blogs, the community forums. Twitter, frankly, I think is one of the best resources for being able to follow updates and see what some of the experts are doing and how they're reacting to all the changes that come. That being said, the constant change is one, from the IT perspective, job security, but it also means that you're not waiting 3 or maybe 6 years to make upgrades, on premises when you had SharePoint 2007, 10, 13, 16. It's a major opportunity to keep at the forefront. So a little bit of change fatigue every so often, I think, is better than a lot of bit of change fatigue very infrequently, because it means people have better features and are able to run with even more tools and opportunities moving forward. When it comes to groups, I do want to cover a few fair warnings here. The first thing is, and I will say this whole session is just one man's opinion. I've spent a lot of time dealing with Microsoft 365 groups and how they work in all the different applications. And I'm going to be pretty frank in this session. I want to make sure that people walk away having felt that they were, not just marketed to. This is, you do want to use these things. They're great, but they do have some caveats that you want to be aware of. And the first is that groups are confusing. They just are, I think, especially because the documentation across the gamut of the different tools that are tied into groups somehow are not necessarily consistent. Even the team that built the groups itself, the membership service in the background, didn't necessarily tie in any or a lot of the connections between things. So just beware that you can see even conflicting information across the different resources. So you're not alone. Feel free to vent and share your qualms on LinkedIn or Twitter or someplace else, and maybe one of those private Office 365 administrator groups on Facebook. But yes, they are confusing, and it's not just you, and it takes a lot of time to kind of do the research to put together to discuss a topic like this. So hopefully some of the resources you find and that I provide here will be useful for you. Another big one is that terminology is absolutely critical to this. So the word group, the word team, these words have effectively been taken away from us from the vernacular. You can't just say a group of people any longer because you don't know if you mean a distribution group, an Office or Microsoft 365 group, or just a general, idiomatic word of meaning group, right? So generally when I write about this, I will be using a capital G for a group, especially for an Outlook group. And I'll talk about the terminology for the different group types depending on which app you're in. They all have different names, but it is critical, and I'm not making any sort of willy-nilly changes or sort of claims here. They are very specific, and try to follow along with that. And when you discuss this with other people, make sure your terminology is correct too, because they could mean different things if you're not being accurate to what the words actually are. Another thing that I want people to watch out for is I've heard from a number of folks the concept and almost defense of groups that it doesn't matter what group you're in or what kind of group it is, groups are groups are groups. And from a very, very technical perspective, that's accurate. I can't denounce that and say that that's not true, because the group is just a collection of people. But when it comes to the user experience, groups are not all groups are identical. They're not all made the same. They don't all have the same features, and they aren't just transferable. You can't just go from one to the other, depending on how you feel on a given day. For all of the group types. So we're going to talk about that. But if you ever run into somebody saying, oh, no, don't worry, groups are groups are groups, not really. From 1% of the time, yeah, maybe. But for the actual use case and the way that people interact with these applications, that is not the case at all. And if you've run into that too, you're not alone. But I just want to sort of throw that out there. Now, the real content of this is going to be covered now. So this is the agenda for this session tonight. The first thing we're going to cover is Microsoft 365 and Office 365, because you can't really talk about groups until you understand the system that this all sits on top of, and especially some rebranding that's been going on recently, which is probably confusing to people. It's been confusing to everybody, and I can understand why the changes are being made. I just don't understand how the process is being done or why the process is being done that way, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Then we'll dive into groups as just sort of a tool unto itself and how you split up your use cases for when you use which type of group. And then specifically, we're going to dive into Outlook, Teams, and Yammer, because those are the three main applications that are sort of built on top of the concept of M365 groups. We'll wrap it up after that. I have a number of resources for you that you're free to take afterwards and kind of use at your discretion and share along with your organization. These slides will be available from the conference afterwards, but also I have a link at the very end where you can just get them right now at the very end of the session, and then you'll have access to all the resources, all the infographics, all that kind of stuff. So the first thing we're going to talk about, though, is this whole concept of Microsoft 365. So until recently, Microsoft 365 was essentially a bundling service or a bundle of services. It came with Office 365, which is the, all of the Office apps, Outlook, Skype, Teams, Yammer, a number of other features like that. Windows was another aspect of this, and then sort of the non-branded concept of the enterprise management and security. So a bunch of data loss prevention, Azure information protection, passwords, that kind of high-level security stuff. Which, from the everyday user perspective, only two of these things would be relevant to them: Windows and Office. Frankly, the EMS stuff would actually be a hindrance to them because it's holding them back from doing their work. But from the IT and security side, it's doing really good work because it's keeping people within their own traffic lanes and following security measures. Now, at the end of March, early April, we had a bit of a change to the concept of what Microsoft 365 is. So Microsoft 365 is now the name for all of the personal and business licensing for Office 365. So the actual plan names used to be Office 365 Business Essentials, Business Premium, Business. They are now Microsoft 365 Business Basic, Business Standard, Business Premium. Also Office 365 Pro Plus, which is basically the installable version of Word, PowerPoint, OneNote, Excel, and I think Outlook. That collection is also now known as the Microsoft 365 apps. It might be more than that. I don't know if Teams counts in that or if Yammer counts in that or not, because they were never really part of the installable package, but it might actually be there as well. What's confusing is the fact that most of the licenses that are not being used by consumers or small businesses remain under the name of Office 365. So anybody using Enterprise E135, First Line Workers F1, Government G135, or Education A135, those are still Office 365 licenses as far as anybody is aware, as much as the documentation says, and I have a link there for the official announcement on this. The point being here, though, is that there is a lot of confusion for the licensing aspect of it, but that's not actually important to this discussion because it was stated flat out that regardless of the license type that you're using, the groups are going to be known moving forward as Microsoft 365 groups because it is a service that will traverse Office 365, Windows, and of course EMS would make sense because Azure Active Directory and other tools like that are built right into that, and Azure Active Directory is what essentially builds you a group in the first place. So we're actually going to dive into groups now. The concept of a group, if you look at the official Microsoft documentation, is effectively this: it's a membership service, right? It's a collection of people put into a container that has a name. The membership is dynamic. You can pull people out, put them in. They'll have access to everything within that container if they're added, including past stuff, and they will lose full access to everything that would be part of that container if they are removed. There are a couple different types of groups. You can have private groups and public groups. Private groups can't be searched, public groups can. But I don't really like this description because this is a very technical, even though it doesn't sound super technical, it really just says it's a group of people and that's it. And to me, that's the least important aspect of a Microsoft 365 group in the experience. The experience that actually matters is the fact that you're getting an online workspace for a specific group of people. So the membership aspect is sort of baseline, that's the foundation. It's just there. I expect it. If I couldn't have that, it wouldn't be a group. So that's the minimum, bare minimum sort of feature that I would expect to move forward. What's really important on top of this is the workspace that I get. So the workspace is going to come with a number of different features. First, you're going to have a way of communicating. You're going to be able to store your files. You're going to be able to keep track of everyday project management, and you'll have this ability to do a historical record. And the concept here is that people that have, that come together and need to go do something, whether it's a business unit or it's a project or if it's a, cross-organizational team doing something, they all need to be able to do at least those things, right? They need to be able to communicate. They need to be able to have a place to keep their stuff. They need to be able to track, and they need to be able to keep a historical record. And that's at a minimum, right? There'll be some certain situations where you'll actually get more than that, or they'll need more than that. So The key aspect here that's the most important when it comes to when you decide to use which type of group is going to be that first one. That which way do you want to communicate is going to be critical, because this is where your decision tree matters. Once you make the decision to go with something like email or a chat space or a social feed, when you make that decision, you're basically kind of hunkering down into that communication method, and you're not going to have much opportunity to jump back and forth between or change up, because once you choose a group and you have the content in that group and it's that type of group, you are going to be sort of in that space. You can't really do a migration from one to the other. So when we talk about this, these align specifically with Office 365 apps. So that's going to be email is going to be in Outlook, the chat is going to be in Teams, and the social feed is going to be in Yammer. So this is probably not a surprise, but what it's going to come down to is, okay, I pick my communication method, which again is really step one. Before you make a group, decide how you want to do it, and then you're going to dive into the app and you're going to create the group that comes along with that application. So each application has its own type of group, and this is again where the terminology is absolutely critical. First up, Outlook groups. So it's kind of a shame that Microsoft 365 group and Outlook group both have the word group, but Outlook started doing it first, so I think they just grabbed onto the word and they just ran with it. Following that, Microsoft Teams came around in 2016. They're also group-based. So when you create a team and you add members, you get a group. The group is existing in the background, whether or not you have an idea of that. And then eventually Yammer was added into this into the fray as well, and nowadays we have this thing called a Yammer community. It used to be called a Yammer feed or a Yammer group even, but it is nowadays it's now known as the Yammer community. So when you go forward and you are ready to start a group, you want to make sure that you know which app to start in here. And there are other apps that you can create groups from, and I'll talk about that in a second, but this is really where you want to start from, and you want to make sure that you consider the decisions that you're making, because if you do go from other apps and you create a group from there, you may realize, oh, I should have done it this way, I should have done it that way. Kind of important to keep in mind. So the online workspace is what's important, especially to me. I look at this from an adoption standpoint, from people using the applications and understanding what they're going to get with that group. So when they go through and they want to create a group, they're basically going to fall into this sort of setup within this infographic that you see here. So you can see if I create a Yammer community, I'm going to get a feed within Yammer. I'm going to get a workspace in Microsoft Forms. I'm going to get a OneNote notebook. I'm going to get a plan and planner. I'm going to get a limited version of a Power BI workspace, although that's actually going to go away sometime soon, but it's still there for the time being, so you do get it if you have the correct licenses. You're going to get a SharePoint team site in the background, and that's where your files are going to be held. Actually, that's also where the OneNote notebook lives. So if you are if you were kind of wondering where is that or how does that work, that actually lives right in the SharePoint site, and it's that default team site notebook that you get. So it's not that it's something separate, it's just that every site gets one of these OneNote notebooks, and you have the ability to surface that, or you'll see it automatically within your Yammer community. And then Microsoft Stream, which is sort of the internal YouTube portal, also will have a connection to your group. So when you create this in Yammer, you get Yammer, Forms, OneNote, Planner, Power BI, SharePoint, and Stream. If you create a team, you do not get a Yammer feed. You get all those other apps I just mentioned, plus you get the experience of chat in Teams. You get a wiki for each of the channels that you create. And the team experience comes along with a lot of other stuff. That includes meetings, that includes private chat, things like that. But from the group perspective and being able to do work and having all those teams with the channels inside and the conversations and the wikis, that's what you're going to get with a group created in Teams or a team. Then the last one is going to be an Outlook group. So you can create an Outlook group right in Outlook, but it turns out there are at least 3 other applications within Office 365 that if you create a new thing in that situation, you will actually get an Outlook group associated with it. So that includes Planner. So if you create a plan, you can have an Outlook group attached to it. If you create a team site in SharePoint, you will get an Outlook group attached to it. And if you create a group in Stream, the video portal, you'll get an Outlook group attached to it. Generally speaking, those can be kind of a clunky way to get in there. So if you do just want the group, or you want to create a new plan or a new team site, you should just create the group in Outlook and start from there, because no matter what, if you create the group, you're going to get all these workspaces, and whether you use them or not, they're going to be there. So you could very well have empty workspaces. And if you're from the IT side of things, I know that probably makes you really itchy. Like, you know, having empty containers in the system is a way of making things messy and not organized. You're just going to have to get over that. There is no way to not do it that way. There are ways to sort of disable some of these apps. They're not vetted by Microsoft, and in fact, there have been a couple blog posts I've seen out there where people have had very bad unintended consequences. It really comes down to, you're not paying for the empty space, so just forget about it. You know, if you're really worried about sprawl, things like that, put on retention policies. You know, have an auto deletion set up every 3-6 months if somebody's never used their group, and that's a good way to keep things clean instead of having to, you know, try to put everything on the front end where it's all about provisioning and training and approving. Just set it up so that there's definitely training, but at the back end, make sure that you have it set up so that people are getting notifications from the owner perspective if they are not doing their using their group. So that's basically the overview of kind of how groups work. I'm going to dive into each one of them individually and talk about some of the features and how they interact with each other. When it comes to the applications that the group apps sort of interact with, it's not just these ones, of course, because these are just the ones that actually have spaces within an Outlook or an M365 group. You have dozens of other applications that you can be bringing into these tools, whether it's into Teams or it's in through SharePoint or if it's in Planner, and that's something that, you know, if you look at the whole breadth of what Office 365 is, and this is another infographic I've produced called the periodic table of Office 365. You know, you're living in Teams, you have direct access to Whiteboard, right? You can open up an Excel file right in SharePoint. You can get access to Delve and bring personal information into a team. You know, you can do all this stuff. So all of these applications still have integrations and are connected to these tools, but they don't have specific workspaces that come along with that group. So you don't get like a protected Word document space. You get a SharePoint site with files where you can create a Word document, but you don't just get a shared space like that within these apps. That being said, all of these apps pretty much for the most part integrate in some way, shape, or form with all or at least some of the Office 365 groups. Okay, so I'm going to start now with Outlook. Outlook is the sort of the base model of groups, and if you look at that infographic and you kind of highlight just the Outlook stuff, you're going to get those base workspaces, plus you're going to get an inbox and you're going to get a calendar. So what Outlook Groups is doing is it's bringing together email, calendar, files, tasks, notes, and a bunch of other features if you want to bring them in there. So when it comes to the email, this is kind of critical because people are still looking at this, I think, from like a distribution group perspective, and it's not that. A distribution group is something that you would email and it would then send a copy of the email out to people. It's also not a shared mailbox, where shared mailbox is something where multiple people have access to one central place. So the concept is pushing out, distribution group, and access from the inside being a shared mailbox. In this case, what happens is you have a shared, a central place where the files are being, or the emails are being sent to, and you can either opt to get those emails and get notifications about those emails, or you can opt out. And that's important because it really impacts how people are going to use this group. So you can use it as email the entire group and send an email to everybody, but they're not really getting the it's not really a distribution group pushing. It's really just giving you access and letting you know that, hey, the group has a new email, you should read this. The group being like the entity, the concept of it, not like the collection of the people itself or who's in the group. One thing that I really like to push, though, is that central email location can be a really good spot for saving important emails. So instead of having people signed up to get notifications about those emails, you can actually just use it as a central repository to just forward important emails. So think of it as like a, what do you call it, the drawer. Filing cabinet, that's the phrase I want. Think of it as a filing cabinet where you can just say, okay, we just signed the contract, the final copy of that contract or the final email message that went out to our, vendor is now official. Send that over to the group email. Now, don't send anything else. It's like, okay, thanks, okay, got it, see you soon, or any other kind of questioning things. Go for just the final important stuff and just CC the group and send the stuff there. That being said, you can use it so that it is being sent out. You can use the email inbox so that other people in the group are going to get notifications about emails to it, which would sort of not be, it would be kind of against the recommendation I just made. And that's because originally people didn't actually get notifications. You now have the concept of subscribing, and I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. The other thing is the shared calendar. This is finally one of the first times that we've actually had the ability for a group calendar to be automatic. And when you send an appointment out to the group, it can go out to all of the people in the group, and it can actually take up their time. So if you want to have a regular staff meeting or something like that, that's a thing you can do. In that situation, you would be subscribed again to what the notifications are from the calendar. Now, if you wanted to use it for something like a vacation calendar, you don't want everybody else, when you send the email to the group, to, and it has a status of all day and you're out of office. If everybody gets that, they're all going to be set as out of office. So you kind of have to think about how you're going to use this, and the notification setup or the subscription model is really important. You want to keep that in mind. So those are the two big things that are going to come with the Outlook group. You're going to get the inbox, you're going to get the calendar. You have to set it up and follow along with how that's going to work. Make sure you stick with it, use it the way that you think is right, but pick one and stick with it. On top of that, you have the ability to add tabs in the Outlook experience. So you have the, you can basically bring a lot of stuff in through, sort of one portal that includes, Trello content, or Trello, Jira are both listed here for project management, Twitter, other things like that. There are a bunch of different tabs that you can add in here. And new ones are coming all the time. So it kind of brings everything all into one place. I'll say if it's a simple business use case. Outlook Groups has its limitations, which is that the UI just really isn't meant to be huge and overbearing. You'll note that even if you go into a group, actually, like with this screenshot, you can open up, the the calendar or the notebook, the planner, the site, but it doesn't open it up in Outlook. It just opens up a new tab. So it's sort of a way of getting to places more quickly and not necessarily sort of an in portal experience, unlike something like Microsoft Teams will say. Now, I mentioned earlier about that subscription process. When you do create a group in Outlook, and again, this is sort of a new thing. I don't know how new, but back in the day, a couple of years ago, this was not the default. When you create a new group, you'll note at the bottom that there's a checkbox that says members will receive all group conversations and events in their inboxes. They can stop following this group later if they want to. This is where that matters. So if you want people to actually start emailing the group as like a distribution list, you need to set it up this way. As the owner, you can set it up to be this way. Individuals can still unsubscribe. So if you look at the right side, the group settings, this view is from an owner's perspective, but individuals can actually change what their individual preferences are here. So if they don't want those notifications, they can turn them off. And that's where it comes down to, you kind of have to talk to your team, to your organization, and say, how do we want to use this? Is this what we want it to use it for? Because if your manager is expecting that everybody's going to get an email when he goes through and says, group X, and you're not getting them, that's a problem, right? So that's something you have to keep in mind. So that's the overview on groups in Outlook. And the next thing I want to cover here is Teams. The naming scheme here is a little bit awkward, of course. Teams. I have meetings every so often with the Teams team at Microsoft, which on Teams via Teams meetings. So it can be a little bit weird of saying this word over and over again. But when it comes to a team in Microsoft Teams, you would go in, create a team. You're going to get that group in the background. You're going to get all the access to all those files, all those workspaces, and you're going to get the chat, and you're going to get the wiki. You also could get, and this is sort of a unique situation, an Outlook inbox and an Outlook calendar. It doesn't come by default any longer, and if you are interested in that, any team that you currently have can be set up to expose the Outlook inbox and calendar, and you'll actually see it in Outlook with the same name as the team under the group section, but the IT administrator has to run some PowerShell to do that. There is some documentation on how to do that out there, but this is sort of where there's a weird overlap between Teams and Outlook in this sense, because they're both, closely related to each other. But when you do dive into Teams, Teams is sort of its own experience here. It really brings in a lot of the features of various different tools. So Outlook for conversations. I'm not saying email. I'm just saying the idea of conversing. Skype for having meetings and chat, right? OneDrive and SharePoint for file sharing, and even the idea of communities in Yammer can be incorporated in Teams. And I don't mean bringing the Yammer community into Teams, which you can do. I mean like org-wide teams, right? Which actually they're just being upgraded to even, I think it's like 10,000 people or something like that. So you can have those types of big teams where community can be built in that without going through the Yammer experience. Now, if you're not familiar with what Teams looks like, this is what it looks like. The teams are in the left side light space there under the title Teams. Each listing that has an icon next to it, like Northwind Traders, HR Onboarding Task Force, those are teams. Each team has a membership. The membership is the group underneath, and each of the teams can have channels. These are topic-specific places for conversation and for files. You can add other tabs and stuff to the top, so you can actually see where files is listed next to conversations, or now it's called posts. You also see some other tabs here like Power BI, Corporate Earnings Notebook, Q2 Planning, Trello. You can add significantly a bunch of different tabs, and it's all inside the team experience. Unlike Outlook, which kind of pushes you out of Outlook, Teams keeps everything here. It actually has its own web browser built in, basically. So Power BI can be loading your dashboard directly in Teams. You don't have to bounce around, no more app jumping fatigue. And that's really sort of the goal here, was that Teams is supposed to be that that hub for teamwork, that single pane of glass access to all that kind of information. There is a lot to know about Teams, especially since you're juggling so many things. The group aspect of Teams is literally only this screen. So if you look at the very left side where you see all those notifications under activity chat, that's called the Teams rail. Those things outside of the concept of the teams have nothing to do with groups. The activity is simply going to give you updates as to what's happening in here. The chat feature is going to be one-to-one chat or one in group chat, but it's all private. There are no groups associated with it. In fact, Microsoft calls that section group chat. I always call it private chat because the word group to me is tainted and I shouldn't use it for anything else. Meetings is going to be just like in Skype. And you'll see actually your entire Outlook calendar there as well. And at this point, it's no longer just your Outlook calendar, it's your calendar. You can make calls from there, you can do files. Your files can actually connect to OneDrive, not just SharePoint, so you can see all of them. So there's a lot to know about Teams, probably plenty of other sessions during this conference where you can learn a lot more about it. I have a lot of documentation, a lot of end user best practices and guides and etiquette tools out there. In fact, one thing you should look for, if you're new to the Microsoft Teams space or you're getting out there, you want people to use it better. I work together with AvePoint, again, sponsor for this session, on this thing called the Guide to Everyday Etiquette Microsoft Teams. You can find this, just Google it, Matt Wade Etiquette Teams. You'll be able to find it, but it covers a lot of basic sort of stuff that we don't really think about. That I don't want to use the word governance because I really hate that word, but like just everyday behaviors and you know, good practices, things like that. Now, if you're interested in knowing more about, you know, learning things about Teams, a lot of resources out there for this. I have a sort of an upper level, meta level resource list that you can find for a bunch of best practices guides, things like that, but also people to follow, which I think is important. There's a good governance guide out there by a couple Teams folks, Jared Mathis and Melissa Hubbard. And then my etiquette guide is linked down there as well. Keeping up to date, actually, I will talk about that a little bit more later. With all of Office 365 is can be kind of difficult, so I got some resources for that. And then there's actually an interactive demo. If you're looking at this point, you haven't dived into Teams and you want to show it off to management to get their buy-in, or to some colleagues to maybe get them jumping on it, the Teams demo is actually really good. So yeah, these resources are really good. But Teams and Outlook are sort of the two that people really get very easily, I think. People know email, they have known it for most of their lives, if not for their entire lives. And for Teams, chat is something that comes very naturally, especially to Generation Z, Generation Y even, and younger. People just kind of get it and they jump right onto it. They just have to understand the setup, right? So as you are building out your team, how many channels you should have, you know, how the urgency levels differ between putting comments in a chat, in a private chat versus in a conversation in the team itself. So these two things seem to make sense to a lot of people. I will say one other quick thing about getting a team from or the group sort of bouncing around. If you create a SharePoint team site, which remember that comes with an Outlook group in the background, you will actually have the option, I think it's still in the bottom left corner, that if it doesn't already have a team associated with it, you can basically teamify that SharePoint site. So that's sort of a backdoor way to getting both the Outlook group and the team without having to go to the IT person to get that PowerShell script to run. That being said, if you already have the team in the file and you don't have Outlook, you can't go the other way very easily. But if you want to go forward, create that Outlook group, you'll get that team site anyway. Don't go through SharePoint, just go through Outlook, it's easier. And then when you go to the SharePoint team site, you'll have the option to connect to a team or something, and then it will ultimately create a team within Microsoft Teams, which is really, really useful. Okay, so moving on from Outlook to Teams, the last one we're going to talk about here is Yammer Communities. Now, Yammer sometimes is hard to get people to sort of understand exactly what it's used for, and I really want to try to get through that concept here, because there's a lot of really good use cases for Yammer, especially in larger organizations. I would say if you're in a group, or if you have an organization of 100 or fewer, you probably have no need for Yammer. Just turn off the license, nobody needs access to it. But once you get to a point where people don't necessarily know each other, not everybody knows each other at the organization, Yammer can be really useful. So when you create a Yammer community, you're going to get that Yammer feed, and you're going to get all the stuff that comes with it. Now, Yammer is the outlier here. There is no connection to Outlook. There is no connection to Teams. You can't jump back and forth. And if you create a Yammer community and you use it for 3 months and decide you don't like it and you want to move to Teams instead, there is no migration method to move your plan and your site and your videos and anything else like that into the team. So when you decide to go with Yammer, you're going to expect to stick with Yammer, or you're going to have to do a lot of manual copying and pasting of stuff going over. So just keep that in mind, because that's sort of one of the big things here is Yammer is not as connected or integrated with Teams or Outlook via groups as the other two are. And the reason for that is actually, let's talk about a little bit of history. Yammer was an acquisition. It was a third-party product that was started in 2008. Back then, I think it had one major competitor, and I think the app was called NewsGator. But it got sold or acquired by Microsoft back in 2012 for over $1 billion. So we're talking like legitimate cash here. And it wasn't until 2017, though, that we actually got integration into Microsoft 365 Groups, at the time Office 365 Groups. Now, if you note that date, Teams came out prior to that. So Teams was actually built on Groups prior, and Yammer had to basically be back engineered to be a Groups style product. And that's, I think, why the underlying mechanisms don't necessarily connect between the three, because Yammer was an acquisition. It had to be incorporated into the existing code base and all that other technical stuff that I can't actually speak to. But I think it's important to keep that in mind. Now, the question I get a lot of times, especially at conferences in person, at least when speaking with a lot of peers of mine, is Yammer dead? What's the point? Teams is here, and it was never the most popular thing in the first place. And the answer to that is it's absolutely not dead. It's actually seen a significant increase in usage, and actually Yammer just went through a major redesign and relaunch, and actually has a number of plugins now and connections to other tools. You can have Yammer communities that are brought up directly in Microsoft Teams, so you don't have to leave Teams to get to Yammer. You can respond to Yammer posts directly in emails, so you don't have to leave the email to go to Yammer. Now you might say, what's the point then? I'm just using email. But if you're going to be using Yammer and you just want to respond quickly, you're not using Yammer. You're just responding to a comment that somebody made, on a Yammer post that you just want to respond to, without necessarily having to leave the experience of being in your email and trying to get yourself down to inbox 0. So if you take a look at some of the data points here, this is actually now a year old. Mike Holste is the product marketing manager for Yammer, and the Yammer team have really pushed this 2020 timeframe as being the year of Yammer. So keep that in mind. Yammer is a big deal actually for a lot of organizations. And there's a lot of use cases here that you might want to consider. But if you're not really super familiar with Yammer, or if you want to share this presentation with colleagues or peers that may not know what this is, Yammer is what's called an enterprise social network. ESN is what it's known as in the industry. And if you want to think about that as related to things that think about it as LinkedIn for work. Or let's be real, it's more like Facebook for work, right? So this new experience in Yammer new UI, better applications on a desktop, on mobile, all that kind of stuff, is really a way to see engagement and knowledge sharing. That's really the way I look at it. And I come from a knowledge management background, so maybe I'm a tad biased there. In company-wide communication, yes, but I really do see that whole, I can see somebody's face, or I can see the CEO commenting on the most recent praise being sent out about Project X being, whatever. But that knowledge sharing is another big one for me. Being able to do the water cooler kind of questions and saying, hey, who here knows how to do blah, blah, blah formula in Excel, right? That's really powerful, especially these days now when most people are working from home if they're if they're a knowledge worker due to COVID. So being able to openly ask questions in groups for communities. So maybe you have user groups, you can have affinity groups, things like that. We'll talk about that in a bit, but that's really where this comes in. Teams to me is where you've got your head down, you're getting stuff done with your colleagues, with your peers. Outlook is where you just send off emails, especially on the outside, because Teams is made more for the inside stuff. And Yammer is more for, hey, put a megaphone to your mouth and you have everybody in a town hall situation. Who knows the answer to this thing? Because I don't want to have to go figure it out myself or come up with something and reinvent the wheel. That's really what Yammer is good for. So let's talk a little bit as to why this separation between Yammer and Teams is actually really important. First, keep in mind here that these two experiences are very different. Actually, the last thing that's listed here I think is most important. Discovery, the algorithm for Yammer, things pop up just like on Facebook based on it thinks that you might want to see this thing or it's something that you were engaged with before, versus Teams is just chronological. So it's kind of like the difference between Facebook and Twitter. And that's because with Teams, you need to be able to see the stuff that you want to see and where things should be. With Yammer, it's more, oh, that's interesting, that's useful. I didn't see that corporate communication, that's useful for me to know. Most things are in Yammer are going to be less urgent. Teams is going to be more urgent because you're getting stuff done. I like the whole people you don't know versus people you do know. In Yammer, you could be talking to the whole organization, whether it's 200 people or 200,000 people. With Teams, you're really in a smaller group. You can have org-wide teams, and that's fine. The use case for that isn't super, huge. Now, for the use cases for Yammer, you're talking here about, I think the biggest thing here is going to be communities of practice and user groups. Every organization seems to have
let's transition to the next.
Every organization seems to have an Excel user group, which is always super huge. But affinity groups, softball league, internal communications, new hires especially because they have a lot. They're all usually learning and they want to be able to learn things as quickly as they can. It's a similar kind of grouping, so it's a good opportunity for them to come together with some similar needs and that kind of thing. So that's a good overview of Yammer. I actually spent a good amount of time on Yammer because I think a lot of people don't really realize exactly what it's good for. Here are a bunch of resources, definitely good for you to keep in mind for moving forward here, especially some of the updates that just came out. Actually,
yeah, you have 4.2, right?
GA so recently. And then the roadmap especially I think is going to be really helpful. And that essentially brings me to the end here. If you haven't been paying attention, make sure to check out the raffle, the link on the bottom left there. You definitely want to get into that. You can get an Oculus out of this. And then we're also, as part of this conference, doing a bunch of fundraising here for healthcare workers, COVID relief, that kind of stuff. We're all living in a new world as it is right now. So make sure to go forward with that, and there will be a donation made in addition to what you do. But the thing that you're really looking forward to is probably the resources. So if you want to grab today's slides, like I said, the conference is going to be sending these out later, but if you want them right now, you can go to that first link that you see there. And one of the more important things to keep in mind is going to be how to stay up to date with all the stuff that happens in Office 365, what happens with Microsoft 365 groups, all of that kind of stuff. So I have specifically called out here an infographic that I've put together called Staying Up to Date with Office 365. So it lists a bunch of the resources that you should take advantage of, how to get to them, and then it also has a link to a spreadsheet that lists all of the blogs, roadmaps, feedback submission, community forums, and official Twitter accounts for all of the apps in Office 365, as long as that content exists. So feel free to check that out. I think it's going to be really useful and helpful for moving forward. This is the link to get there. And at this point, I'm going to jump over back to Teams to see if there are any questions in the Q&A area. But again, feel free to follow me on Twitter. I put out content pretty frequently. You can again connect to me on LinkedIn. If you need to email me, by all means, I'm able to answer questions. And then feedback, super important. We really appreciate feedback. So if you want to take your camera or your phone out right now, all you have to do is open up the camera and just hold it up to this QR code. iOS and Android will automatically open it for you, bring it up in your favorite browser, and just answer a few questions and let us know how I did and how the conference has been